when I joined Labour, when Corbyn was leader, I went in with a whole range of Marxist criticisms of the Labour Party. And then after 4 years of being in a left-led Labour Party, led by the most left-wing leader Labour's had since the 1930s, every single one of my Marxist criticisms was only confirmed even more, with actual, even more ample evidence to point to some of the problems of Labour in terms of it being any kind of, class struggle party or even a, social democratic party these days. So what I want to do is kind of go through some of the criticisms which I think for me were really which I already knew before going in, but I think was certainly confirmed by the experience of even being in a left-led Labour Party, and then kind of talk about some of the things that we're debating now on the left, because obviously the defeat of Labour in the general election in December and the arrival of Keir Starmer as leader of the Labour Party is causing all kinds of debates and turbulence within the Labour left over how to respond to that. I think first of all we have to start from a criticism of the last few years and the Corbynite left, which is that it failed to transform the Labour Party fundamentally, and it failed to turn the Labour Party into a party that could win elections as well. During Corbyn's time, extra parliamentary politics in Britain really collapsed. And so it meant that when movements like Extinction Rebellion emerged to, face the real overwhelming problem of the coming climate catastrophe, movements like that were really bereft of class politics. There was very little kind of socialist sort of intervention or kind of arguments that went on there. And I think that it really suffered as a result of that, because everyone was understandably focusing on Labour and trying to, push forward Labour as much as possible. And now kind of the Corbyn era is over. What do we have to show for it? We've got some quite left-wing manifestos in 2017 and 2019, neither one of which really mentioned the word socialism, but they were certainly a break from neoliberalism and kind of austerity politics. And if we'd have won the elections either in 2017 or 2019, we could have conceivably moved Britain back in a more kind of more classical social democratic direction again. So, again, a kind of a mixed economy with Labour managing capitalism in a slightly nicer way. But that's, that dream's kind of over now. And Keir Starmer's victory, it is causing a lot of people to resign from the Labour Party. I know Rowan mentioned that the Labour Party is claiming 600,000 members now. The Labour Party's membership figures are always a bit distorted because they count people for quite a few months after they've resigned, and obviously lots of people joined Labour for the election, and probably quite a few people cancelled their subscriptions after their their preferred candidate lost, or so I think we have to be cautious about that. And even if we do talk about the large membership of the Labour Party under Starmer, even if we assume every single one of those people is still in the Labour Party, under Corbyn we totally failed to transform the 500,000 strong Labour Party into a mass campaigning party. It was still what Labour has always been, and I don't think it's going to happen now under Starmer. Starmer represents a return to the centre left, the traditional kind of terrain of Labour. I don't think he's a Blairite, but I think that he is more of a Kinnock figure. He's kind of pulling the party back towards the centre from the previous kind of left leadership, and it will potentially open the way for a more right-wing leadership after him. And Starmer's comments around Black Lives Matters are kind of indicative of that. You have a photo of yourself taking the knee, say you're in solidarity with black people, because of course you have to as the leader of the Labour Party. You can't not do that. But then in terms of practical policies or politics, nothing. One of the main policy announcements that came out from the Labour Party during the Black Lives Matters protest was that they would back the Tory party policies to make it a 10-year prison sentence for graffitiing war memorials. This was the response of Labour to the Black Lives Matters protests. And as Rowan said, we're already seeing the failure of the Corbyn movement to transform Labour in any meaningful way, with what's going on in Tower Hamlets now. Sack and re-engage 4,000 workers just to try and force them onto worse contracts on worse terms and conditions, and to break their unions. This isn't particularly outrageous for Labour. It's just the most recent, most egregious example in a long history of Labour in local government attacking communities, attacking their workforces. And again, the Corbyn era really did nothing, to change that dynamic at all. So what are the kind of, like the Labour pains that I think the Corbyn era had the prospect of challenging, but ultimately really failed to challenge? I'm going to talk about the parliamentary cretinism of Labourism, the electoralism of Labour, the constitutionalism of Labour, and the gradualism of Labour. And obviously, there's no brick wall between these things. They all kind of overlap into into what is Labourism. But if we were to try and think about them distinctly, obviously the parliamentary cretinism of Labour is something that Ralph Miliband talked about, back in the 1960s, that Labour is a very undogmatic party about its socialism. It's a broad church, packed full of liberals, but it is dogmatic about one thing, which is that parliamentary sovereignty is sacrosanct, and parliamentary sovereignty is where all power really resides, and that is where you need to be if you want to affect kind of any change in the country. And of course, Corbyn spent his life as a backbench MP, out on the streets and in protests and getting arrested by the police and anti-apartheid demonstrations and so on. But when he became leader of the Labour Party, again, that kind of integrationist pull into the centre, into the kind of the mainstream of Labourite politics was quite overwhelming. And the kind of single-minded focus on trying to win the general elections, failing to win the general elections, but trying to win the general elections, was absolutely over-determining. And I think that, it relates to the point I made earlier about the general collapse of kind of extra parliamentary movements during the Corbyn era. The second one is, the constitutionalism of Labour, the idea that, all just authority derives from law. And this goes back to the debates that some of the Labour left had in local government in Popular and in the 1980s, whether it's better to break the law or break the poor. The Labour Party and the Labour right are very determined, like it's better to break the poor, and that's what we're seeing in Tower Hamlets as well. You have to fixate on kind of a legal, very kind of narrow definition of the parameters in which politics operates, which is the constitutional sort of arrangements that we have in Britain at the moment, and how that feeds into Parliament as the kind of the pinnacle of the any possible democratic input into the British Constitution. And again, that wasn't really challenged by the Corbyn era, which I think for me was a real shame, because as I said, Corbyn I think represented the best chance to kind of introduce a new, more radical, transformative idea of what a Labour leader could be, and that just didn't happen. I wanted to talk about the gradualism of the Labour Party as well. I mean, this is, there'll be a number of comrades on the call, this isn't a particularly new thing. But certainly I think that one of the things that we saw under Labour, under Corbyn's Labour, was still that sort of idea of kind of like the slow, peaceful reforms that are happening. And as anyone knows, the class struggle very rarely happens in this kind of slow, gradual, piecemeal way. And certainly if you compare some of the manifesto's demands under Corbyn to what Labour was suggesting in 1983, it's well to the right. There's no sort of, in 1983, there was at least the idea that there might be some kind of class opposition to the politics of a Labour government, a left Labour government, and therefore you would have to take some quite radical action. So, for instance, the demand that if any of the Labour government's policies are blocked in the House of Lords, and Labour would just abolish the House of Lords. The idea of saying, we're going to do this, and if anything gets in the way, then we're going to, clear it out the way. We're going to use all the powers that we can to ensure that, the democratic vote for a left Labour government can be realised. And again, that hasn't really sort of translated into anything. And I guess, again, the the way that Keir Starmer responded to the Black Lives Matters movement and calling it a moment, not even being able to relate to, this kind of spike of radical energy which has been unleashed from what's going on in the United States and kind of finds an echo in the UK. Labour's got no, Labour's got no real orientation to that. It's got nothing really to say around it, apart from to kind of, wag its finger at a movement if, anyone pulls down a statue or something like that. And the final thing is just on the kind of the electoralism of Labour, which, that is come back with a vengeance. I think there was a lot of ideas under kind of Corbyn's era Labour that, we could try and be clever with the electorate, we could try and put forward some radical proposals, whilst also appearing quite moderate, but maybe being radical in some aspects, but not in others, which actually led to like a slightly confused messaging, because you couldn't tell if Corbyn was just meant to be a sort of standard social democrat like in Sweden in the 1970s, or was meant to be some kind of, like pseudo-revolutionary force here to fundamentally change politics forever. Like the Labour left couldn't quite make up its mind what the overall narrative was. But the electoralism that we're seeing, now coming back from Labour around, the sensible, moderate opposition, not having opposition for its own sake, trying to sort of, think about ways to appease wider sections of the electorate. And that these siren calls around winning back the red wall voters is not going to be about trying to change any of the views that people might have, which led them to voting Conservative in 2019, but will just be about pandering to them and trying to give them what they want, which of course is, classically what Labour has done. So just kind of in conclusion then, I think that sort of, if we think about the struggle in Labour as a struggle between trying to transform the party and transform society in a more radical way, or being kind of integrated into the existing power structures that exist within both the party and the state, I think we can see that kind of the transformative moment under Corbyn has, been, I think that chapter is closed. I know there's still battles going on over the NEC and, these kind of, but like, I think these are sort of, these are the, the dying shots of the Labour left's current campaign and current incarnation. I'm not saying the Labour left is dead permanently, but certainly for now, I just don't see there's any way of it coming back anytime soon. If you lead the Labour Party to 2 election defeats in a row, then ultimately most Labour members will look for another, leadership, another programme to try and deliver victory. And that's what's going on at the moment. So there's been lots of debates like, should Socialists stay in the Labour Party or not? Should we go off and do something else? And I think at the moment what we need to do is we need to be very clear about, why Labourism failed in 2019, failed under Corbyn, and what are the lessons that we need to draw out from that in terms of a socialist strategy for power and a socialist strategy and how that can be embedded in an organisation. I think we have to really, I don't think we should be too ultra one way or the other. I think those people that are saying, leave Labour now en masse, there's no point, it's completely dead. I don't think that's feasible. Labour is still the opposition to the Tories. It's still got 10 million votes at the last election. And although I think the parameters and the terrain in which Socialists will be able to intervene is narrowing incredibly fast, I don't think there's very much, that Socialists can really get out of Labour at the moment. Nevertheless, there will still be battles and arguments, particularly around conference, around kind of key policies and, and so on. So I think kind of, the idea of everyone just leaves now and, doesn't get involved, I think is too rigid. But I also think, those Socialists that are saying, oh, it's just extra parliamentary activity, build the demonstrations, let's have a protest, let's have a petition on a street stall. I think we also have to be careful about that kind of politics, because I think, that is just the ABC and bread and butter of what Socialists do. Like, that's not particularly like a strategy. That's just what you do, like on a bad day when you've got nothing else to do. We have to be thinking in the context of the climate change crisis, in the context of the growth of the far right, in the context of the greatest economic crisis this country has potentially seen in the history of capitalism. How do we pose the question of alternative society and a struggle for power to how to get there? What is a strategy that Socialists can try and develop and win a section of people to get from the inevitable protests and the resistance to some kind of challenge to power? And within that context, I think Keir Starmer's Labour Party is increasingly going to be on the wrong side of history. I mean, we saw how Kinnock's Labour Party acted in the 80s. Yeah, no one was saying you shouldn't be active in Kinnock's Labour Party, but the idea that Kinnock's Labour Party was going to be a fulcrum through which radical politics could happen is just clearly not true. And I think that's going to be doubly true of Keir Starmer now. So, I think that's probably what we need to be discussing about as socialists. What is a strategy, starting from the next 10 years of huge crisis that we're going to be facing, and therefore what kind of organisation can be developed that can try and develop that strategy, win the vanguard masses that are fighting against the system, to the idea of a better world.